joined us for the virtual training, the student core growth, what students have and how they can develop. Really looking at supervising student staff in a variety of all shapes, sizes, and forms in the different ways that we do, virtually, in person, etc. I'm really excited to be here with Greg. My name is Emily. My pronouns are she, her, and hers. I work at the Laurie Student Center in training development and the SLICE office in co-curricular leadership. Greg, do you want to introduce yourself?
Absolutely. My name is Greg Head. I use he, him pronouns, and I am the Associate Director of Career Education at the Career Center here at Colorado State University.
Great. So we can advance to the first slide. So hopefully you all are somewhat familiar with the Zoom platform. There's a couple different ways and things that you're looking at. You might be joining us from phone or tablet or screen, but you might be seeing some sort of this. We will be using the chat function at the bottom with one of those red arrows. You can mute and unmute yourself both in the lower left corner and on the participant bar. So when you click participants, that one that says 13 on the bottom, you can see that we have 26 folks joining us today currently. And then you have the option to do different reactions, maybe a thumbs up if we ask a question, but we would love it to be as interactive as possible. Rachel is demonstrating for us and will be also playing the tech host role for us as well. So invaluable there. If you have any questions, you can feel free to private chat Rachel as we go along, or share it out because someone else might have the same question, and we will do our best to look at the chat, and Rachel will be doing that as well. So thanks so much for being here, and without further ado, we'll get started on some of the content. So as you hopefully saw in the workshop agendas and the schedule for the week, that we have really asked to be centered and grounded within our CSU principles of community, of inclusion, integrity, respect, service, and social justice. We believe that all things that we do within our positions and hopefully personal experiences at CSU are grounded in these principles, and they can drive us to be to hold us to an integrity and to be part of a community that we can all be proud of. We have work to do, and hopefully these will go. So, Greg.
Awesome. So we just want to kind of emphasize the learning objectives we set out. So student staff supervisors will learn skills to assist in the development of student employees' professional core competencies. Student staff supervisors will gain an understanding regarding student support and campus resources. And student staff supervisors will learn to assess students' employees' performance and make adjustments to their work and development plans through this idea of how to integrate competencies and their growth processes that they do as college students.
Great. So if you've been on the shapes.colorado.state.edu website, you may have seen the employee life cycle, or you may have been familiar with it before. This is to recognize that so many of us have a job to do, have a position, and oftentimes student staff can help some of those objectives be fulfilled, but we can think of it as just hire, train, go, do. And really there is a holistic life cycle of an employee, of the transitions that they experience that start really as soon as they are hired on and even before that. So the ways that you market your jobs, where do you get your applicants, how do you conduct the interview, and what kind of questions do you ask, as well as when they get the offer, how is that offer made? Is it via email? Is it on phone? Is it in person? Or is it a mass hiring? All of those communicate values and culture of the organization or department that they're joining. The transition in the life cycle continues on to that onboarding. I think many of us can think, yep, that's the couple of days training beforehand. If I'm hiring them in the middle of the semester, I've got to quick train them in for the things that I need them to do. But really, again, the onboarding is an elongated process that continues to communicate the culture of the organization and what their expectations are. So everything from the ways that you all agree upon communicating, the initial training, the continued training, that's my dog.
Glad it was yours and mine.
I mean, it's going to be one of ours, right, in this virtual space. So everything at that onboarding, and in most positions, it's the first 6 months of a position, at least. Sometimes with those more complex jobs, the first year or even two is really understanding that. With our students, sometimes there's turnover, and but it is a more elongated process, and how we think about how they are onboarded is important to consider. This shift encourages us to look at a culture of retention and belonging. Many times students might need to leave a position and we say, oh, it's all external forces, they've got a lot of stressors going on, that's not my problem, I can't deal with that right now. And it encourages us to look at what our culture of retention and belonging is within the environment that we're asking them to work. It's a both and, right? Sometimes in student affairs, for those of you who are familiar, we love the both and. There absolutely are a variety of stressors that I don't know if you all can attest to this, but there have been definitely stressors within 2020. And none of us really know what next year looks like for a variety of different reasons, both sociopolitically, where we are with our racial justice movement currently in our nation and world, as well as that we are still grounded in the middle of a pandemic. And so what and how are we going to be taxed with the challenges and really create that culture of retention and belonging? Professional development is something that we really want to look at in terms of these students being developed through these positions. So regardless of the type of positions, they're learning either direct or transferable skills that will encourage the competencies, and Greg will talk about career competencies that we can be grounding and understanding our positions within. So anything from meetings, evaluations, in connection to their future, and a variety of other things. And then transition and offboarding, whether they are graduating, whether they are shifting to a different position, or whether there are a variety of other pieces, what the offboarding looks like, whether that be an exit survey, a celebration, or whatever the circumstance calls for, is part of that cycle. Next slide, please. So I know we overviewed that pretty quickly, but we want to pop it to you all now, right? In the chat, if a couple of you will pop in, what do you already do? When you look at these 5 different aspects of the cycle, what do you already do? Maybe there's not even an interview and you just hire, right? What do others in the chat do which you could fairly easily do? So that's a 2-part question, right? We're gonna ask for a little bit of engagement here. I'm gonna make sure that I can see my chat bar as it's going. But take a moment to really look at the different pieces, and maybe there's something that your office or department does that's a tradition that looks at that culture of retention and belonging. Maybe you support your students through one-on-one meetings every 2 weeks. What are some things that the 27 of you all do already? A few words are great. Silence is very much okay. Trying to work on professional development through monthly trainings, regular one-on-one meetings, absolutely. Pretty much all in slice with plenty of room for growth, monthly staff meetings, celebratory moments embedded in celebration. Market, face-to-face interview, make an offer as soon as possible, meet frequently, love that. We are intentional about showing student appreciation. Absolutely. Challenge and support is definitely going to be one of the models that we talk about here. So feel free to continue popping those in the chat in terms of thinking about and really considering the environment that we were in and we are in. What are some of these things that can continue around this? Sam says regular check-ins, getting their input for programming, professional development throughout the year, allowing peer mentor to take ownership of programming. That leadership aspect is so important, and I think transitions great into some of the competencies that Greg will talk about.
Great, I'll jump in here. So one of the strong efforts since I've been in my role has been to integrate competencies into the student employment, on-campus employment positions. Sarah Rader, who serves as kind of a counterpart on the student employment and employer connections part of career education has been really thoughtful in how to make sure that competencies are a part of the conversation throughout the life cycle as much as possible. So just kind of an overview of the competencies. We're going to talk about what a competency is, why they matter, how they were developed. I think that's important. And what are the ways they can be applied and are being applied currently. So a definition for career competencies is the ability to demonstrate a skill or knowledge proficiently. And so why would these competencies matter? It's a common language for employers and students to share. So while we are definitely wanting students to integrate that language here in student employment and within the campus, just as important is making sure that they are speaking a common language with employers when they're graduating and getting those positions after they graduate, whether that be undergraduate or graduate school. So we want to create that language, but we also want them to be able to speak and articulate their experiences through the lens of these competencies that are important to employers. So employers are looking for individuals with these competencies that they've told us time and time again. These are the essential skills is often the language you'll hear them use. They may not use the word competencies, but they'll say these are the essential skills that we need from graduates. And so out of that comes the desire to make sure we're preparing students really well for those essential skills whenever possible and be able to identify when they've been developed. So just a note is that definitions given by the Career Center Resources, they're a starting point. The common language is really the naming, and we encourage everyone to think and contextualize the definitions they give. I'll give some considerations to this idea of how do we define the different competencies well for our students, first and foremost. So where did they come from? How did this idea of career competencies develop? NACE, the National Association of Colleges and Employers, released in 2015. And right around that time, peer institutions that we often look at, Clemson, Ohio State, UC San Diego, some others as well, they kind of looked at the competency, said, how do we make these adaptable? How do we adapt them really for our student population and what we're hearing from employers in our area where our students are graduating and getting jobs? And so the important piece here is that both the paradigm or the focus on competencies has traditionally been and historically been on what employers want. So there may be some pieces of why isn't this a competency? And I think that those are great questions, and we're considering those questions, and that I think will change the focus. I'm hearing a lot of conversation around competencies not being focused as hard on what employers want, but what we believe graduates should have in order to succeed in the future of workforces. So I want to emphasize that because there are some questions about why aren't certain things in the competencies, and it's because, to be frank, by and large, this is what we're hearing from employers. And so if employers aren't bringing certain pieces up, it requires that we shift focus if that's where we take the competencies. So one of the big efforts that we made when we decided the names for CSU is inclusivity. We wanted the names to be as inclusive as possible and take away some of the problematic language that existed in what we saw from the NACE competencies. And we also got feedback from employers that we were missing a couple of competencies that they felt were really important, those being creativity and self-reflection. If you asked other individuals, they might have justifications of how those lived within the competencies NACE has, but I felt that they were so strongly expressed by our employers that they needed their own space, they needed their own competency. All right. So here is just a quick picture of all of our competencies. So I mentioned earlier, one of the ones that we were very deliberate in changing the name, NACE has a competency called professionalism and work ethic. We have done a lot of work in the Career Center, as much as we can so far, and we're going to continue to do the work around problematizing the word professionalism. It is laced or an umbrella term that often is used to hide discrimination. And so we felt that it was important not to perpetuate that word as in any form, that we needed to look at what are the pieces of that competency that are important that we put out there with a different name. And so we felt that personal accountability was that. So that's just one example, but there are a few others that we took the language and we really said, how do we make this more inclusive of student experiences that may have felt excluded in a lot of cases. So, we're going to talk about the competencies and how they've been integrated. And as I talk about them, I want to take these considerations into kind of as a caution, I guess. Individuals shouldn't be reduced to these competencies. It's important not to overemphasize the competencies. We don't want it to become where individuals are looked at as commodification of people as labor. Like, that is a really important piece, that where it would devalue the individual and their uniqueness. We want to make sure that it helps and complements what they can bring to an interview, to the experience that they're showing to employers and they're developing in different experiences, but we don't want it to be the be all end all, if that makes sense. And then I mentioned definitions. I think it's really important to consider broad definitions of competencies to ensure the largest amount of experiences are considered. So I want to give the example of leadership. What does leadership look like? Well, there are some very narrow definitions of leadership in many spaces, and that would leave out a lot of individuals that don't share that definition, maybe from a cultural perspective of what leadership has looked like for them. And so as much as possible, I think it's on us within the CSU community to really think through how can we keep the definitions as broad as possible and help students understand that leadership, as an example, can look in a lot of different ways, and make sure that they have a strong sense of how they lead and how they can articulate that leadership skill and competency. And I think it's important to consider, is it possible some individuals have more access and opportunity to develop some of these competencies or this language around competencies prior to college? How do we make competencies? We're trying within the Career Center, but how do we as a CSU community make these competencies accessible to develop equity across the campus? So how are we applying them? Where are these really happening? So 2 spots in particular are happening within student employment. One is in the job description and the posting, and then the student staff evaluation process. We will make sure to give you all the links to all of these resources. So I'm just going to back up to this. We actually have a PDF form of this with the actual definitions. Like I said, the definitions we created are starting points for you all to think about what they mean in the context of what you do. So we'll share that out. And then we will also be sharing both the student staff evaluation process that exists on the Career Center website under the employer toolkit, as well as the job description template. So, so the job template, there is a job template within that gives you, within the employer toolkit, that gives you a strong sense of what we believe is important to put in a job posting. And what is included in there is the competencies. It's included because in terms of the examples and how your job description, what the pieces of what students do, having that abbreviated version of the competency. So the name has an abbreviation that we created, and then you list all of the competencies underneath to give context to those abbreviations. So that's one spot that the job description is being really pushed to have that language to start the whole process from the very beginning. And then we don't have it in here, but there is also a whole job. Maybe I'll take a step back before the parent share and just talk briefly about the process where we really created, in the Career Center, we had created a kind of an evaluation process that integrated the competencies. And what we did is then created a version that was more broad, that allowed it to be shared out. And that is also within the employer toolkit, and we can share the link to that as well. So just know that that is there for people to kind of look at, and then also to customize to their needs. We don't think that it'll fit for every need the way it is, but it's important to take what is helpful and try to integrate that competencies conversation in the development process and the evaluation process throughout the year, let's say the academic year that a student staff is in their position to start out, especially.
So it says parent share, because the first time Greg and I did this, we were in person, but we're going to put you in breakout rooms. Rachel, if you could help us put 4 people in a breakout room. We're just going to give you about 5 minutes to meet some other folks around campus. The questions that we have are, what competencies can students develop in your position? So this is the application of this training, right? So Greg talked about those different competencies. Hopefully you all were able to get the PDF that I shared about the handout, so you can reference the competencies when you're in your breakout room, if you can download that and see it. We can also put that in the chat as well. And then what additional ideas do you have about integrating competencies into your students' job experience? So this is taking whatever area you're overseeing or working with and thinking about what specific skills in alignment with these competencies can connect. So I'll put the questions in the chat. Hopefully Rachel will have us in 1 second be able to,
How long do you want folks in breakout rooms, Emily and Greg?
Let's do 5 minutes with a 30-second pullback, if that makes sense. I'm trying to copy the different competencies into the chat, so if folks aren't able to download it, they can have reference to it. Thanks for your patience as we are navigating new terrain as well. Copy, let's see how this works. Might not be pretty. Ooh, yeah, no, that's not pretty. There's somewhere in that they don't have the spaces in between it. So, all right, Rach, why don't you open those up and we will see folks back in about 5 or 6 minutes.
All right, everybody, you should get an invitation to join a breakout room in just a moment.
I hope Greg leaves his breakout room. I mean, I guess he can be in it. Hello, Becca's tablet. Oh, there she is.
Oh, there we go. I know, I wish there were a way, I don't know if you know, I haven't found a way yet to leave anyone out of a breakout room unless they're the host, like even if you're a co-host.
The actual host. Yeah, I haven't either.
So.
And I wish he were, I wonder, can you open it and see if you can send him out? I think he's using a different version that I have. Can you do that?
I can't pull him out. I can only move him to a different breakout room. And he's currently in a room, unfortunately, with only one other person because Pamela has 2, and I had it all set up, and then we had someone join right before you all moved everyone. Okay. So I had to redo it. And I didn't get to, I had moved her strategically.
That will be just fine. Maybe I will. Maybe I'll have this shared while he gets back his sharing when it comes. Because because I'm the next one, so that's fine. And I can see. Right after the breakout rooms, will you put the attendance link in?
Absolutely.
What time are we until? 30
I thought
to
it was
50.
2:50.
Okay, so we've got plenty of time. Oh gosh, did we pause the recording? The competencies in the position, and one of the pieces that Greg was talking about is in the toolbox. is this student staff evaluation process. So this is just a screenshot of what you'll have access to in the link. And maybe while I'm talking about the theories, Greg, if you want to put the link in the chat, if that's easy, you do that too. Yeah, but let's grab two people off of mute. I know we didn't set up any ground expectations around this before, but will a couple of you share and come off mute about what competencies students may be able to develop in your positions? And I can go back to the competency wheel so folks can see it. Who wants to go? Two people, please.
Okay, Emily, I'll speak up.
Thanks, Nancy.
Anytime. One of the biggest things that I was telling them in the chat room piece was that with my students, most of them, when they come on board, it's their first job ever. So time management, critical thinking, all those personal accountability pieces are so key and so ground level that's where I have to start.
Absolutely. And thanks for bringing that up, and how many where that might be the reality. And so you're almost setting standard without knowing it for what they'll come to expect from other jobs too. And so that can be great, and it can be also interesting for them. But looking at those time managements, even, I'm hearing career development in that. You talked critical thinking and problem solving, all of those things that might just be able to be developed or transferred from what experience they had before, right? Because lots of our family or places of origins or home life can look like a job or have those responsibilities, and then how do you transfer it to now a paid position? Thanks, Nancy.
Right.
What else? Who else? Question again, what competencies can students develop in your position, or what additional ideas do you have about integrating competencies into your job experience?
I can go. Yeah, I think Slice does a good job at a lot of these, and then the ones we don't do, we do pretty poorly in, which is digital proficiency is one of them. And so thinking about how we have so many students in positions that somebody else does marketing, they have that digital proficiency, they're over there. And I'm just trying to think of how I don't even have digital proficiency, and I had such a learning curve, even though I feel somewhat savvy in some ways. There's just, the more I learn, the more I realize I didn't know. And so, yeah, I think like for them to be able to be digitally proficient, I'll have to do more of that, and we'll have to do more of that to be able to have that one even be touched on besides those that are in that specific role.
And how much has digital proficiency just changed in the last 4 months? Like all of us have had to advance our digital proficiency. And so I think it's important to have those conversations with those around us around how they had to develop. Like it was a forced development of that competency. So what are the ways that we're going to have to do that in other contexts in the future? We don't know, but it's good to keep track of those and to think about where are the gaps still in that development of that proficiency, as an example. Yeah.
And actually a shout out to Sarah, who just shared as one of the most gung-ho professionally developed humans, who also then learns and then shares with Shape the Trainer on Thursday. If you're interested on how to more virtually do more virtual engagement and learn some strategies around that, she'll be with us on Thursday. So thanks to the both of you. And really, as we continue talking about where we'll go next, which is around some student theory and student development, we want you to keep considering where these competencies fall and lie, right? And how it can create a holistic picture of the positions that you're like, wow, I never knew there was so much to it. Or you're like, no, I did, I'm just not quite sure how to integrate it. And there are smaller ways that we can and talk about at the end. This is great. And keep talking on the chat and use that as an engagement platform also. Okay. Okay. So when Greg and I were thinking through putting this together, we wanted to make it really robust and representative of what students are going through, knowing that the context and understanding that they're in college during this time is an interesting time point in their life, right? And it's not to say that those of us who hold professional jobs or 45 to 60 hours a week or whatever, hopefully you've got some good balance there, but there's always different life balances going on. And, we talked already about the different stressors that exist. And this transformative time in folks' life around college is something that there are whole classes and courses on in terms of student development theory. So we wanted to take a couple of those accessible theories and plant some seeds for you all about how you might utilize these. Now, we also want to recognize that theory is laden and from a framework often of, to be very transparent, cisgendered, white, oftentimes straight men from a Western US context. So it is not necessarily inclusive or holistic, but can be seen as some trends along the way. We recognize that even myself and Greg, we have our own limitations around what experiences we might have had or what identities we hold. And so it's not holistic, and hopefully whatever experiences and identities and stories that you bring to the fold, to the mix, to your experiences and positions, you can find pieces of these that are applicable for how you might utilize them. Just a little bit of the disclaimer that I will share around, I think, as Greg said, problematizing theory also. One of the ones that I oftentimes think of, because to be honest, it's one of the more graspable ones for me. I sometimes like to take complex ideas and say, okay, but like how can I conceptualize this and make this kind of in bite size? And so this theory of challenge and support that was first presented by Stafford and then by some others really sees, you'll see a scale in the bottom right corner of the slide, that it's this constant balance. And arguably 2020 has provided some exceedingly stressful challenges, and with unknown ways or less familiar ways of how to support during this time, right? So when we look at the theory of challenge and support, how I might even talk about it today already feels different than when Greg and I presented this in March before, I think we presented this 2 weeks before we all maybe left what we had known as reality. I know lots essential workers have still been working in those environments, and lots of our environments have shifted. When we look at the theory of challenge and support, this is the aspect that college students have the potential for significant growth and develop during their collegiate experience. This is all due to the college environment, both inside and outside of the classroom. So the things that they're learning, Nancy already talked about critical thinking and the ways that they're maybe learning about Black feminist thought and then coming and applying that. My sister works in GIS for UC Denver and has someone really grounded in feminist and queer theory who's wanting to bring that into the GIS world and make it more accessible to previously disenfranchised folks. So the things that they're learning in different areas are also coming into the environments where they're working with us, right? But there's lots of growth because of just the context of this consistent learning. This theory states that for optimal development, this balance of challenge and support must be experienced as appropriate to the task or situation. So what that really kind of breaks down to is that greater the challenge, greater the support needs to meet the challenge. We know that the realities is that the pandemic has disproportionately hit marginalized communities harder and differently than some other folks, and that support that is needed and not existed. I've already talked to students who needed to discontinue going to school because either the virtual realm wasn't working, they didn't have access, or a variety of different things. And so when there is a lot of challenge, how do we, in the ways that we can, meet those challenges with that greater support, and recognizing that this is where equity comes in. And when I say equity, I mean that equal is treating everyone exactly the same. Equity is recognizing that different circumstances call for different treatment sometimes. And so challenge and support is a great example of this, that if there are less or different challenges being experienced, then the support looks different. So it's not a one-size-fits-all. Are there any questions? Please pop them into the chat or raise your hand, and I'm happy to kind of pause and slow down and address anything. If there is too much challenge without support, fatigue and frustration lead to feelings of I can't do this, right? If there's too much support without challenge, the students won't be pushed to learn what is needed to develop the skills. And so we see this a lot in the supervisor context of you hire someone on and you're like, I need you to know that you can just hit the ground running. Can you just take this little piece of information and just go? And they're like, yeah, I can do that. But they don't necessarily have maybe they have the skills, but not the readiness to be able to do that. They don't know how it might look in the lab that you're working in, or in the office, or around, Microsoft 365 or something like that. And they want to, but if there's not that transition, if we don't look back at the life cycle of that onboarding and training around that professional development, they won't be set up to succeed. And then this fatigue can potentially lead to leaving, right? It can lead to too much and this frustration that can feel. Conversely, if you are someone that I have had to work on myself, right? The micromanaging type, the kind of looking to and being like, okay, are you doing this? Are you doing this? Oh, let me just take that and I can do this. And right, they're taking all the ownership and agency around. So you can see that it's a balance for the supervisor too, because then if it's too much support, if it's too much taking away of that agency and feeling like they can do this, that they won't be pushed to learn or develop, and then will disengage from that. So again, you can see where this theory of challenge support for me is graspable, and it's still laden and complex in some of the ways that we think about it. The takeaway is really to offer appropriate support based on the position requirements. So that can look like taking a look at your job description, and based on maybe those first couple of meetings, saying, where are you feeling strong? And I want you to hopefully feel like you can tell me where you're going to need some training areas. Remember that the job is not the only aspect of college life. We'll talk about that in one of our scenarios. There are many other factors at play that are going on for the students that we're working with. For us too, right? And in this one, we're talking about specifically student employees. So that was one theory. We wanted to introduce you to two theories, because research shows that the types of involvements that students have during their collegiate time really bolsters their experience and the potential growth that they can. So through involvement, through student employment, through working with you all in a variety of different ways, they are then hopefully bettered and developed in some of that. Student involvement refers to the amount of physical and psychological energy that the student devotes to the academic experience. So that might be, there are different levels of involvement, of engagement. I always like to kind of break down just the atrocious amount, understandable when you look to it, but when you just see that sticker shock a little bit. I hope there's no insinuations with that phrase, but like that sticker of the total cost of a year of college, when you break that down into what they're paying per time they go or not go to class, it's so much money each semester, right? And so, but what is that physical and psychological energy? We know there are many barriers in being involved in maybe some of the ways they want to be involved. Maybe it's mental health, maybe it's financial stressors, which is exceedingly high. And there's just some barriers around that. And so some might want to engage differently, but again, those challenges are so high or so strong. But when there is the support and when there are the skills, that involvement can lead to this deep and depth of devotion to their experience within college, which includes their job, right? Involvement theory states that the amount of learning and personal growth associated with any educational program is directly proportionate to the quality and quantity of the student's involvement in that program. And so this is really where we like to talk about depth, not breadth. There are some students who have had 6 different jobs in a 3-year period at CSU. Maybe they have 3 jobs at the same time because finances necessitate that. Then there are other experiences or possibilities where students can really go deep. Maybe working with some folks, I worked with some students at the Pride Resource Center who started their 1st or 2nd year and all the way through graduation were with the Pride Resource Center. And that's just one example, and there's lots of departments here of the ways that they can deeply ground and then create that robustness within their involvement of it. So the takeaway around Aston is that student employment is an opportunity for quality and quantity increase in involvement for our students in their development. It gives some of those tangible, experiential, understanding ways to even sometimes apply what they're learning in their classrooms. It gives those experience-based involvement activities along with a paycheck and some of the things that are needed. When we just see, well, they're just here because they need to be, it minimizes the potential and possibility of everyone here's positions that you work with that can be so much more for their students. And sometimes that's just, again, going back to the life cycle, looking at maybe it's meeting with a student once every 2 weeks just to touch base and say, how are things going? What do you need? When you're like, that's not necessarily needed. Maybe it is, or maybe it would be beneficial for you and for the student. So those are a couple of the theories that we wanted to introduce you to. And I feel like I have talked a lot, and I just learned in one of Sarah's sessions that there needs to be engagement every 7 minutes. So we are going to practice on some student employee case studies. And so what I mean by that is we have this case study that we'll put the text of it in the chat also. Actually, Greg, will you help me put the text of the case study in the chat? And so what we're going to do is through this case study, we want you to think about those 3 things, right? We have the employee life cycle, we have the competencies that Greg shared about us, and then the 2 theories that I shared. When you look at this case study, and we're only going to do one of them because of time, we want you to think about what might be going on and what you might do. I'd also encourage you to, if you are able to access the handout that I shared in the chat, that will have some resources and ability to look at that too. So Ellis is a 3rd-year student who has worked for you for over a year. There has been a demonstrated strong work ethic in the past and communicative personality. Recently, you notice they are withdrawing from others at work and in virtual staff meetings. There was a significant outburst at one of the staff members last week that you heard about. When you ask to check in with them, they share their grades are slipping and they don't know if they can keep going to CSU. They came out to their family over winter break and their parents threatened to not support them financially. So Greg put the case study in the chat. We're going to break you into a little bit different of those rooms. So if we could redo it to have 5, like upwards, like between 3 to 5, but 5 people in the room, just to give enough folks. We also understand that these trainings, we definitely track that the number of participants decline when we go into these spaces and rooms sometimes. And we also recognize that within these trainings, that engaged way to really take the material and apply it to something and make connections at CSU is pretty powerful too. So we hope you'll stay with us and look at this case study. We're going to give you about 6 minutes for this one. Greg, does that sound okay? Awesome. So 6 minutes, and then Rachel, if you can look at the settings that we give them a 60-second pullback as well, that would be great. Any questions before Rachel invites us into those breakout rooms? You can use the chat or come off mute.
Emily, this is Cody. And you mentioned some resources that were sent. Are you able to share those in chat?
Yeah, I'll try and see if I can. So tell me if something comes through for you right now. It says on my end that it was sent successfully and you just never know.
Yes.
But it should be a PDF that came by. Okay, great.
Yep, I got it. Thank you.
Awesome. So in this case study, right, there are a few different things to assess what you might do in this. So questions like what you might do, and then if resources would be appropriate within this, what are resources that could both inform you in how to support the student and resources that you could connect the student with. So I'll put that in the chat also. What would you do? What resources could inform you, question mark? What resources could assist the student? Okay. All right, Rachel, let's open up those breakout rooms now. We'll see you in 6 or 7 minutes. First, Rachel's going to put the attendance link into the chat, so feel free to utilize that now. I know people have different things going on. It's about 2:30. We have 20 minutes left in this session together. So we wanted to know, hopefully, again, from 2 or 3 of you who are willing to come, you can chat and we'll ask you to come off mute. So if you're like, I want to add in something about either what you would do, what resources you would utilize, or what resources you would also assist with the student. Those are the 3 kind of asks. So put something in the chat and might look for 2 to 3 different voices to come in. I know this is a tough case study, but there's lots of possibility, and I'm guessing that you all had some conversations in those small groups. So just share whatever kind of how you would approach it, or maybe some questions you would have. Resources. I can think of a couple off the top of my head. Hey, Pedro, I was hoping I wasn't gonna put you in, but
I was like, fine. Something that we talked about in our group, and I think it's important, is kind of figuring out what resources and thought processes the student has already gone through, because oftentimes they've already talked with a couple of friends or even family members to kind of process a lot of the information going on and a lot of these stressful situations. And so I think from that you can kind of game plan where the student kind of moves forward. And something that I kind of brought up was kind of assessing how long this problem has persisted in their lives, because oftentimes there's a root situation or cause to something that they might be going through. And then that can really relay as to whether we connect them to counseling services or some other off-campus provider or on-campus service. So that's kind of my first instinct as to how I would approach this situation.
Thanks, Pedro. Pedro talked about some good kind of assessment of the situation and maybe considerations as you're thinking about, what support they have, what support they might need or be looking for, and they might be kind of some of those resources at CSU. So I know we have a plethora of awesome humans on this call, and that virtual is kind of nerve-wracking. And what are some resources, some CSU resources for the student? I'm going to share my screen again to allow you to look at the case study. But there's a lot potentially going on right here, right? Like Pedro talked about counseling centers, counseling services may be something, and potentially what else, right? So there's pieces and finances. Who else? One more person.
One of the things our group talked about was case management. Just because they have a lot of different cases, they can connect the student, whether it's to their professors, it could be the employer. It sounds like they may potentially have financial issues, so the Office of Financial Aid. And one of the resources that had also come up was I also can't remember the name, but the student referral. I can't think of the name at the moment, but through safety and assessment could also be another resource.
The student referral, I for some reason, like tell someone is coming up, but I don't think that's what you're talking about.
Tell someone.
So, okay, great. Okay, cool. Yeah, so Sam's referencing some really awesome resources that CSU has through the Office of Support and Safety. There is both an anonymous and confidential way that you can connect in if you are like, oh, I'm going through this, I'm not quite sure how to handle it, and they are kind of this clearinghouse of resources, and have you talked about this, or maybe this is that. And so Tell Someone is an incredible resource to have, and it's still very much operational. Also through Support and Safety Assessment is the bias assessment team, where students, staff, and faculty can report incidences of bias, and I just think that's helpful information to know. Nancy also had mentioned one thing is to have your resources on hand and know resources and what they offer. And so, you know, one of them I'll do a plug if you're in kind of a professional development desirous mentality. The Pride Resource Center has safe zone trainings that are incredible to go through and to learn more about specifically, right? So we don't know necessarily a ton about this student, and it wouldn't necessarily be appropriate to ask, well, what do you mean you came out? Like, how do you identify? Not the time necessarily, right? And if you go by off of what they are sharing, you can pick up on some of those pieces. So when we ask like what you would do, what are some of how do you have resources at hand? And also not just throw resources in their face, right? There's this human connection first. There's this I think sometimes we can get really hyped or anxious about, oh my gosh, well, what do I do in this situation? And really listening oftentimes is the best first measure. And as Pedro talked about, there might have already gone through a variety of supports that they have, or mental processes for themselves. And there is an impact of what's going on and showing up at work. But this is an example of, you know, how challenging support might be at play, how there's some significant challenges about like, I don't know if I'm going to be able to say at CSU. And as Sam referenced, financial services is awesome to be able to talk through, and through Pride Resource Center, they have, it's confidential for the student too, but you can apply for some emergency funds too. So just knowing that those are some different things that you're like, oh my gosh, I didn't even know about that. And CSU in a variety of different ways has some of those supports in place, and it's just important to kind of reference. So in that vein, thanks for those of you who are able and willing to come in and engage a little bit. We want to talk about, kind of wrap this up with some campus resources or campus support. Before I do that, Greg, anything from you in terms of either what you all talked about or some adds you want to make at this point?
Sure, I think we were talking about in our previous time, you and I did this in person, we made the recommendation in terms of having resources on hand, and it may be even more applicable now, is to make like a folder of bookmarks of the different resources on campus. And I would say that like, if you haven't revisited them since everything's transitioned, or a lot of things have transitioned to remote, not everything, but a lot of things have transitioned to remote, understanding how like the engagement from students has changed, and understand even as we transition to something different in the fall, how knowing, like, I think Nancy brings up a point, and an important part of that is knowing what they offer. What do they offer in the context of the specific time we're in, whether that be summer or fall, under different circumstances than what we've known in the past too.
That's awesome. Thanks, Greg. So that's a perfect segue, kind of where we'll go and end up. This PowerPoint, Rachel just put the attendance link into the chat. And so if you click that and let us know that you're here, we will send you out this PowerPoint with all of these clickable links. And so we'll also send out the link that Greg referenced to the toolbox with some of those other resources for you. So thinking about those employer resources for the Career Center, Sam talked about student case management as being a great clearinghouse for students and the ability to see what resources are there and what options they might have. Student diversity programs and services, these are 7 identity-based centers around race, ethnicity, disability, gender, and sexuality. And those are located within the student center. And a lot of those abilities and remote have gone remote as well. And so still are offering some incredible services all the way from the Black African American Cultural Center to the things that the Women and Gender Advocacy Center are putting out. It's pretty awesome. So as Greg mentioned that. Slice through from a resource-based standpoint and what some students might be struggling with, Rams Against Hunger is a resource that is still very much going. There's a huge pantry that has kind of taken over the Laurie Student Center Theater that operates multiple days a week. And so that's one of the things that has transitioned, and we will just see more around basic needs coming in the next year. Student Financial Services, we mentioned Health Network. You at CSU is a internet-based one where students can participate and take an assessment based on their own experience. Rams Fail Forward is an awesome program, just more around teaching, and then this would also be where counseling services or physical health services could be utilized as well. Student Conflict Resolution Center is great at some of those different disputes that they might be either taking into the workplace or happening within the workplace. And university housing, if a student is experiencing housing insecurity, or if there's just different things that can be talked about. So these are a few. These are not an exhaustive list by any means. I want to read Nancy's comment and would invite some folks to put in what are go-to resources that you appreciate that you don't see referenced here? How do we source from the expertise and experience of the group? So put that in the chat in the next minute or so. Nancy says, as a CSU employee, we have some excellent training online through training and risk management. One really good one is specific to students at risk and what to look for. Yeah, absolutely. Thanks so much. Off-campus life as a great resource to utilize from everything from, roommate roundup to first-time homebuyer classes to shovels or to just a variety of, and I know I just skimmed the surface of what they offer. Anyone else? So a question that we might leave you with also, ALVS, absolutely. So that's the Adult Learners and Veteran Services Office. Student Legal Services, yep, also located physically in the Laurie Student Center and operating remotely currently. These are great. So thinking about how individuals could incorporate resources discussed into your student employment experience, right? So we started this, what feels like a little bit ago, on the life cycle and recognizing that it's a whole circular experience and a cycle into the competencies, right? Those different areas that we want to help bolster the skills around, and then understanding a little bit around student development theory and what they might be going through. And so thinking about to have them having a full, robust experience, supporting in different ways, recognizing that there are these resources, how you could incorporate them into team meetings or talking about different opportunities on campus, encouraging involvement through, I know, the real leadership experience, the Rams Engaging in Active Leadership will be online workshops that students have available for their professional development coming in the fall and could be really supported through your student employment opportunities this fall. Greg, what else? as we go into our wrap up or takeaways? Folks can start preparing around this.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's important, like we talked about how we prepare ourselves, but how do we make sure that these resources are available to students that we supervise on a regular? So when we were talking to a group that was completely in March, we were completely in person. We talked about the idea of having like those support resources on a page that's in the kitchen area, or, you know, it's identified in different spots, but maybe there's a way to make sure those resources are in an online spot for all of our student staff as well. So I think about like not only availability and organization of the resources for ourselves, but just for our students, and making sure that they know where they're at within our spaces, whether that's remote, virtual, or in person.
Awesome. You want to take us on to the wrap up and takeaway?
Yep. So in the chat, we would just really appreciate share 2 things you will be taking away from this training. What are some things that you hope to move forward differently, given the information that we shared and some of the conversations you all had? So I'm seeing Nancy says, my department need to up our game on offboarding, and 2, update my resources page. I like it. Joanne mentions career competencies, employer toolbox, and evaluation templates. That's great. Cody mentions I will be creating a folder of student resources to keep virtually and checking in with my students, with my student who isn't working in the office over the summer. Great point. Yeah, it's a different check-in process, right? And so that's a really good point. So Pedro mentions thinking about ways we could go about challenging, supporting our students and adapting that to the needs of our marginalized student populations. Yeah, really good point. Oh, here we go. Here's a cute. Knowing what to do. Becca says, knowing what to do well and improving what we don't do to better support students as they learn. Yeah. And then Amy mentions working on balance of challenge and support and developing career competencies. And then Hannah mentions career competencies and how we can try to incorporate them into everything we do. Having student resources in an online folder, talking about resources during meetings so people know where they are and what is available. I like all of that. That's awesome.
Sorry, Greg, I was just seeing what was next.
No, it's totally fine. No, it's totally fine. We're getting down to the last couple minutes, so if people have a few others, that's great.
Rachel, while those last ones are coming into the chat, do you want to put that attendance link one more time in there?
I like Hannah's idea of career competencies and how we can try to incorporate them in everything we do. Part of it is we're still learning all the different ways we can incorporate them. We all need to source from all of you and what makes sense based on the different positions students have around campus. And so what are other ways? We talked about, you know, the job posting and the development. Maybe it's in the training in some way, so that when you get to that evaluation process, it's even more comfortable language for the students and for ourselves too.
So with that, we'll look to the chat if anything else comes up. Thank you to everyone who was able to make time to be with us. Again, this recording will be on the SHAPE YouTube channel, so if anyone was hoping to attend but wasn't able to, they can. This and another one that Summer will be doing on Thursday around Gen Z, they are 2 of 4 that are associated with the Elevate Student Supervisor certification that comes out of the Career Center. And so Greg had mentioned Sarah Roeder, who, is it Rader? Sarah Rader?
Yeah.
Rader, who kind of oversees and works with that, and we'll have more information about that. So there are 2 other ones that are going to be available throughout the end of the summer and into the fall. But if you came to today's and you go to Summer's, you will already be half done, is my understanding. So thanks so much for being here. I see some of the awesome, oh, thank you, Sam. Sam put a link to what I was just mentioning about, so click that link and we'll put that in the email that follows up if you fill out the attendance link. So thanks a lot. It was great to see some of the exit messages. And yeah, Greg, anything else?
Nope, that's it. Thank you all.
Awesome. Have a really great rest of the day. And there's one more session for Shape the Trainer at 3:30 today. Thanks, Sam. Thanks, Tony. Bye.